This training is for educational purposes only and does not replace current Medi-Cal policy, agency procedure, clinical judgment, or legal advice. Staff should follow current requirements and consult the applicable policy documents. Welcome to this Compass Care HR for clinical training on after submission, tracking, deferrals, denials, and billing rules. In our previous training, we discussed how to prepare and submit a complete treatment authorization request, or TAR. But submitting the TAR is not the end of the authorization process. In many ways, it is the beginning of the next phase. Once a TAR has been submitted, the agency must track it, respond appropriately to requests for additional information, manage reauthorizations before existing authorizations expire, address denials, and make sure that billing remains consistent with what Medi-Cal actually approved. For this lesson, remember two governing policies, Policy P5-009 and Policy P5-010. Staff involved in authorization, clinical services, scheduling, EVV, or billing should understand their responsibilities under these policies. Let's start with what happens immediately after submission. Every submitted TAR should be logged and tracked. The agency should maintain the TAR control number or other applicable tracking information, the beneficiary information, the service requested, the requested authorization period, the submission date, the current status, and any follow-up action that may be required. The TAR control number is particularly important because it allows the authorization to be tracked throughout the process and may also be required during billing. Once submitted, the TAR should not simply disappear into someone's inbox or be assumed to be processing. Pending TARs require active follow-up. Under our process, TARs should be reviewed and tracked at least weekly. The purpose of weekly tracking is to identify pending requests, deferrals, approvals, denials, approaching expiration dates, and any authorization issue requiring action. This is especially important when ongoing patient care depends upon continued authorization. That brings us to reauthorization. When a patient continues to require an authorized service beyond the current authorization period, the agency should not wait until the existing TAR expires before beginning the reauthorization process. Under our policy, a reauthorization TAR should be submitted at least 30 days before the current authorization ends. Why 30 days? Because authorization takes time. Supporting documentation may need to be updated. A physician order may be required. Assessments may need to be reviewed. Medi-Cal may request additional information. A TAR may be deferred. Starting the process early provides time to address these issues before the existing authorization expires. The goal is continuity. We do not want to discover on January 1st that the patient's authorization ended on December 31st and no reauthorization has been obtained. A good authorization system therefore does more than track what is currently approved. It should also identify what is about to expire. Think of the authorization expiration date as a deadline that requires advanced planning. Now let's discuss deferrals. A deferral is not the same thing as an approval, and it is not necessarily a final denial. A deferral generally means that additional information or clarification is needed before a determination can be made. When a deferral notice arrives, treat it as urgent. Read the notice carefully. Identify exactly what information is being requested and identify the response deadline. Then provide exactly what was requested by the deadline stated on the notice. Do not respond to what you think the reviewer should have asked. Respond to what was actually requested. For example, if the reviewer asks for an updated physician order, provide the appropriate updated physician order. If the reviewer requests clarification of the number of hours being requested, address the requested hours and provide the supporting documentation. If additional clinical information is requested, work with the appropriate clinical personnel to provide accurate documentation responsive to that request. The response should be complete, accurate, timely, and supported by the patient's record. Never create, alter, backdate, or manipulate clinical documentation simply to obtain an authorization. That principle applies throughout this entire process. The authorization must follow the clinical record. The clinical record should never be changed simply to fit the authorization. Now let's discuss denials. When a TAR is denied, the first step is to carefully review the determination and understand the stated reason. Do not simply resubmit the same information and expect a different outcome. Determine whether the denial resulted from missing information, insufficient medical justification, an incorrect service request, an eligibility issue, lack of supporting documentation, or another stated reason. When appropriate, the request may be corrected and resubmitted in accordance with applicable requirements. But the agency should also recognize that a denial affects the beneficiary and family. The applicable notice of action explains the beneficiary's rights, including applicable state fair hearing rights. The agency should provide required appeal rights information and cooperate appropriately with the beneficiary, family, Medi-Cal, and other involved parties in accordance with policy. Staff should never promise that an appeal will be successful. Our responsibility is to communicate accurately, provide appropriate information, maintain the clinical record, and cooperate with the applicable process. Now we move to one of the most important areas of this training, billing. An approved TAR does not create an unlimited authorization to bill Medi-Cal. The approval has boundaries. Those boundaries may include the authorized service or procedure code, number of units, frequency, and date span. As a general rule under this training process, bill authorized services only after the applicable approval is in place and only for services that were actually delivered and are supported by the clinical and service records. Never bill simply because units were authorized. Authorization is permission to provide, and bill qualifying services subject to applicable requirements. It is not evidence that the services actually occurred. For example, suppose a TAR authorizes 400 units through December 31st. The agency's records show that 430 units were delivered. How many units may be billed against that authorization? Only the 400 approved units may be billed to Medi-Cal under that TAR, unless an additional authorization covering the additional units is obtained and applicable requirements are satisfied. The existence of documentation showing 430 units of service does not automatically expand an authorization that only covers 400 units. Likewise, if 400 units were authorized but only 350 units were actually delivered, the agency cannot bill 400 simply because 400 were available. You bill for qualifying services actually provided, not simply for the maximum amount authorized. This is why reconciliation is so important. Billing staff should reconcile authorized units against the underlying service documentation, including applicable visit records and electronic visit verification, or EVV, records. Ask, was the service actually provided? Was it provided to the correct beneficiary? Does the service match the authorized code? Was it provided within the authorized date span? Are sufficient authorized units available? Does the visit or EVV documentation support the claim? And, where required, is the correct TAR control number associated with the claim? This creates a simple compliance principle. Authorization, service delivery, documentation, EVV, and billing should tell the same story. If those records do not agree, stop and investigate the discrepancy before submitting the claim. There is another rule that must be absolutely clear. Never change documentation simply to make it match the authorization or the claim. Suppose billing discovers that the authorization allows fewer units than the service record shows. The answer is not to reduce, rewrite, or otherwise manipulate the clinical or EVV documentation to make the numbers match. The documentation should accurately reflect what actually happened. Authorization discrepancies should be handled through the proper authorization and billing process. Clinical records are records of care. They are not numbers that can be changed to make billing work. Finally, let's discuss what happens when an authorization or billing problem is discovered after billing has already occurred. Suppose billing identifies units that were billed to Medi-Cal without a valid authorization when authorization was required. Do not ignore the problem. Do not assume that because the claim was paid, the payment was appropriate. Payment of a claim does not necessarily mean the claim was compliant. Under the agency's billing integrity policy, the issue must be reviewed and handled appropriately, including self-reporting and refunding an identified overpayment when required. This is why internal reconciliation is an important compliance control. The purpose is not merely to find underbilling, it is also to identify potential overbilling or improper payments. Before completing this training, remember the major rules. Every submitted TAR should be logged with its control number and tracked at least weekly. A reauthorization TAR should be submitted at least 30 days before the current authorization expires. If a deferral is received, provide exactly the requested information by the deadline stated in the notice. If a TAR is denied, review the reason, determine whether correction or resubmission is appropriate, and recognize that the applicable notice of action explains the beneficiary's state fair hearing rights. When billing, bill only qualifying services actually provided and supported by documentation within the applicable approved service code, units, and authorization date span, and include the TAR control number when required. Reconcile billing against visit and EVV records. Never alter documentation merely to make it conform to an authorization. And if the agency identifies services that were improperly billed without required authorization, follow the agency's billing integrity process, including applicable self-reporting and repayment obligations. The easiest way to remember the entire post-submission process is track, follow up, reauthorize, respond, reconcile, bill, correct. Track every TAR, follow up on pending requests, reauthorize before the current authorization expires, respond immediately to deferrals, reconcile authorization against actual services and documentation, bill only what is properly supported and authorized, and correct identified errors instead of hiding them. A TAR does not end when it is submitted, and it does not end when it is approved. The authorization remains part of the patient's compliance and billing process throughout the entire authorized period. Before taking the quiz, please review policies P5-009 and P5-010, paying particular attention to TAR tracking, reauthorization deadlines, deferral and denial procedures, billing controls, documentation integrity, and overpayment handling. Once you understand these responsibilities, you are ready to proceed to the quiz. This training is for education and workflow guidance only. Always follow current Medi-Cal requirements, agency policy, and applicable clinical and legal guidance.